Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Atwood Museum. Actually, I'm going to step off the stool so I don't fall and kill myself. Welcome to the Atwood Museum. I'm Kevin Wright. I'm the executive director here at the museum. And welcome here for our Tuesday talks at the Atwood. This is part one of a two-part series and a collaboration with the Chatham Marconi Maritime Museum Center here in Chatham. It's called Women at Sea, Then and Now. On part two will be with Sarah Casamillas, and that will take place Thursday at 7 o'clock, this coming Thursday. So you can still get reservations through either of our websites, but tonight will be Barbara talking here at the museum. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Bob Fishback, Liz McCarty, and Ron Ferris for making this happen. They were great to work with and coordinated all this event, and they're doing this nice recording for both of our museums, so that's really good. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, a couple of housekeeping items. As we prepare for our 100th anniversary in 2023, the Atwood Museum is officially closed to the public as of now, with two exceptions. On Tuesday, November 22nd, just before Thanksgiving, will be our historic bake sale. A wonderful event that we have here at the museum. So please come by. The doors will open at 9 o'clock. If you're interested in pre-ordering pies beforehand, go to our website. But we will have pies on sale and other baked goods here in the mural barn, and that will be going on all day until the baked goods are sold out. So please make your plans. It's a great fundraising event for the museum, and we have wonderful bakers within the community that make this a really special event. Let's see, what else we got? On Saturday, December 10th, we will be having our annual hearthwarming event. This gives us an opportunity to actually put a fire on in the fireplace in the old house. And that's always a really fun, warm event. So make plans to bring your family and friends. That will be one event. We'll have things going on in that room. We'll have things going on in the mural barn. The rest of the museum, because we have some construction going on in November on the roof, will probably be closed. But nonetheless, it will be a really fun event. So please make your plans to come and see us on that day. It's a great event for the entire family. One final note, please make sure that you turn off all your cell phones. As I noticed, everybody's having wonderful leftover candy from our Batwood event. Please make sure you're not crinkling paper during Barbara's talk this evening, okay? So now I'm happy to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Barbara is a South Chatham resident, a researcher, and docent at the Atwood Museum. She also sings with the Cape Wide Chatham Chorale and its chamber singers. Barbara spent most of her career before retirement as a children's librarian at public school, public library, and a private school in New Hampshire. After living for 38 years in New Hampshire, Barbara and her husband Paul retired to South Chatham 13 years ago. Having grown up in Fairfield, Connecticut, 3 blocks from Long Island Sound, sailing boats, and having spent summers in Chatham for 55 years, moving to South Chatham was like coming home. I've gotten to know Barbara very well over the past 7 years. She's a great person and a wonderful friend of the museum. And it's my honor to introduce Barbara Semple.
I will use the stool so you can see me and hope I don't fall off. Okay. This is my talk on Women at Sea, Sailing the China Trade Routes, 1892 to 1906. Over the rolling, roiling seas, instead of in front of the warm glow of a fireplace in Rockport, Maine, what bold and brave women these women were. My talk today is based on the journals of my great-aunt Frances Brastow Amesbury, the wife of Captain Stanley Amesbury of Rockport, Maine. Frances was born in 1869 and Stanley in 1868. Before I get into Frances' life at sea, let me give you a taste of the not-so-unusual circumstances sea captains found themselves in at sea. Jabez Amesbury, Stanley Amesbury's father, captained a coasting schooner, the S.D. Talbot, in 1876 en route from Cuba to Boston. He relates this tale in the Amesbury family history. We were scudding before the gale under a two-reefed foresail when I saw a wall of water sweeping down upon us. I was lashed to the weather rail, and the helmsman was lashed to the aft rail. Never lash a man to the wheel, he advised before continuing. When the sea had gone over us, it had taken everything its gigantic wrath could move: the foresail, the boom, the wheel, and the rudder. Even the quarterdeck was broken. Bravest of all on board was my wife Anne, who, when the schooner was in imminent danger of sinking, sang ditties and told stories to keep our little boy from being frightened. That little boy was none other than Stanley Amesbury, who would become a sea captain himself and marry Frances Brastow. Stanley captained the ship William H. Macy after his father. This is Captain Stanley Amesbury with his spyglass at sea. He went on to captain the bark Adolph Obrig. Francis sailed aboard both vessels with him. These vessels were built by the Carleton Norwood Shipbuilding Company of Rockport, Maine. This was to become one of Maine's finest shipbuilding yards. Vessels of various varieties were built: brigantines, schooners, barks, and ships, to name a few. They helped Maine gain prominence in the maritime history. The following few pictures are examples of what the Carleton Norwood Company built and what happened to various vessels. This is the ship S.D. Carleton off Cape Horn, February 19, 1891. It was cut down for a coal barge eventually. The ship Billings was the second four-masted ship built in the United States in 1885. She was the largest square-rigged vessel built in Penobscot, Maine waters. The Carleton Norwood Company would always be noted for, quote, its breed of captains who were considered the hardest nuts in the Cape Horn fleet, according to Basil Lubbock in his book, The Downeasters. Most of the ships managed by Carleton Norwood Company were notorious for their hard-hearted, grim-visaged, work-em-up skippers. My family is also related to the Carleton family. The company built more than 53 vessels during the years 1844 to 1891. The bark Jenny Harkness, built in 1879, was sold to the Germans and renamed Freda. The ship Raphael, built in 1875, started out of Rockport Harbor in a booming gale, almost drove ashore on Ballard Park, backed the foreyard and sheared it off. The spanker blew out and bolt ropes and sailed over an Indian island. Bark Richard Parsons, built in 1878, drove ashore on one of the Philippine Islands and went to pieces. As you can see, not all vessels sailed without some mishap or disaster. I learned about this wonderful family history from my father and my uncle, who often summered with their Aunt Frances in Maine. She was without children and adored her two Pennsylvania nephews, so invited them to share in the interesting stories and sights of Rockport, Maine. My father is on the left. Frances was only 26 years old and Stanley 25 when they began their first voyage. It was not so unusual as you may think for women to have spent time at sea, mostly as the wives of captains of their large sailing vessels. Wives went to sea mostly as companions to their husbands and hostesses at teas and dinners when in port. The companies that owned the vessels encouraged wives to sail, as they felt the captains were more content and dependable with a wife aboard, and the crew was better behaved. It became the rule rather than the exception. In 1880, a Searsport, Maine census showed that 36 wives in that small town were sailing with their husbands out of a population of only 2,322. They sailed what was called the China trade, going from New York to the Philippines, Singapore, and Hong Kong mostly. The bark Adolph Obrig was built in 1881. She was 184 feet in length and 38.6 feet in breadth, and her gross tonnage was 632 tons. Their cargo was mostly oil and kerosene, coal and salt to the Far East. Frances writes in January of 1899 of returning to New York from Hong Kong with a cargo of matting, fans, and chairs. Other items brought back from China were silks, Nanking, which is a coarse cotton-like cat fabric, tea, and porcelains. Here are some of the things that Frances brought home. These are the shoes for a woman with bound feet. They're about 4 inches in size. Generally, it was a practice for females. Rich women would have their feet bound, while the poor would not. That's mainly because the rich had servants to serve them, since they could not walk. The poor girls needed normal feet in order to work. Bound feet were considered a sign of wealth and beauty. Though today we might consider such hard pillows uncomfortable, the ancient Chinese people saw practical application in them. See the picture of the porcelain pillow. Sima Guan, a famous historian from the Song era, used to sleep on a hard wooden log. Such a pillow apparently prevented him from oversleeping, allowing him to dedicate more time for his work. Some Chinese slept on bamboo pillows during the summers. They were deemed cooler. Hard pillows like those made from ceramics were also seen as ideal for keeping hair from getting messy. Since maintaining hair was a time-consuming affair in those days, resting the head on hard surfaces allowed people to retain their hairstyles. Because the pillow was near the brain, it was considered to help with depression and stimulate the brain. It was also thought that it helped to dream, and dreams were considered to be omens at one time. Frances kept 5-line-a-day journals from 1892 to 1908. She tells of her life in Rockport, Maine, when not at sea, as well as her amazing adventures with her husband while on board the Adolf Obrig. And here on the table on the far left is a copy of her journals that you may enjoy looking at. These journals were not easy to read between the faded ink and the script in which they were written. To read through a year, one had to start on the left of the top of the page and read to the right for the next day. You can sort of see 2 columns there. Then turn the page for the next 2 days, and so on until you got to the end of the journal. Then it was back to the first page and the second line down for the next year, and so on down for the 7 years. Yeah, you were a little crazy by the time you finished reading those. Each entry, when at sea, begins with the latitude and the longitude. It's been interesting to figure out their travels using these entries, and in today's world, I can use a phone app to chart their courses. When she would record the weather, then she would record the weather and the seas, such as on September 4 through 6, 1892, she wrote, "Heavy gale, horrible, ship heaving and laboring heavily, sick. Moderate sea, still sick." Other times she wrote of fog, hail, lightning, and what they called baffling winds, or just being in doldrums for days on end, making little headway, delaying shipments, and often in extreme heat. And it was boring. A great description of the doldrums comes from the book Windjammer Bride, the journal of Angie H. Chapman's voyages on the Maine-built sailing ship Leading Wind. Landsmen are prone to think the only disagreeableness at sea arises during bad weather, but this is a great mistake, for no feature of sea life is more wearing than a calm for more reasons than the loss of time. The ship stands helplessly upon the waters, every sail spread to catch the passing breeze, and flapping, veering, straining, and slatting at every heavy roll, which sent her rocking at one side to the other. Sometimes it seems as if the masts must slack from themselves with the great strain demanded to right herself. After a day or two of such experience, I've been more tired and worn out than in a heavy gale. Written in the journals more than once was of the cabin flooding in the heavy seas. There were wet rugs and bedding. Frances was joyful when good weather came and she could hang these things out on the deck to dry. In March of 1898, she writes while in the Indian Ocean, Rough cross seas, got lots of water in the cabin. Wretched. Everything wet. Very miserable. Very wet. Frances yearned to be on deck as often as possible rather than being confined to the cabin, as it was her only form of exercise, to walk the deck with her husband. Between seasickness and rough weather, much time was spent cooped up in the cabin. Women generally had little to do with sailing the ship or communicating with the crew, and the crew was not to communicate with them, most of the time with the exception of the steward and perhaps the carpenter, only isolating them even more on their rolling home. The carpenter could fix anything on board, from rudders to chair legs, so he was a very essential part of the running of the ship. This is a picture of John Shaw, the carpenter, on the Yo brig and his shop. And there is his shop. J. Gainsford was the second mate on the Yo brig. These pictures are not often very clear, as you can see, and the reason was Frances took many of these pictures. So you're looking at pictures that are 125 years old. The rest of the crew were a varied bunch of nationalities and talents. One woman wrote in her journal that she regularly served as librarian to the seamen, distributing books on Sundays from the lending library. Sometimes the captain's wife took care of sick crew members, and some wives who were good at mathematics helped with the navigational calculations when stars or sun readings were taken. There are stories of women who took over the running of the ship in emergencies and saved many lives. Generally, though, the captain's wife pursued her own activities: sewing, embroidering, writing, reading, sometimes laundry, and special baking. If children were aboard, women became school teachers as well. Some collected botanical specimens as a hobby, a good hobby for someone cruising the world. Some made pictures out of sea mosses. This is a picture of the type of camera that Frances used. She took up photography, so she had something to do while she was on board ship. And they were using these enormous box cameras and tripods. She also did her own developing on board the ship, and as you can imagine, she probably only did that in calm seas. The red circle shows the navigation light structures: red for starboard side, green for port side. They are backboards mounted in the ratlines. Ratlines are the lengths of line tied between the shrouds of a sailing ship to form a ladder to go up into the rigging. This is a picture of Frances sitting on one of the navigational structures. She's boldly holding onto the side of the navigational light structure. It looks like she's out over the water, but she is more likely just barely inboard. She was not a woman who was afraid of very much, being willing to go to sea, to the other side of the world, and in the most unpredictable weather. She wrote of seeing whales, dolphins, flying fish, Cape pigeons, how she loved sighting land, even at a distance, for the joy of seeing something green. She often recorded seeing sightings of other vessels nearby, whether they were distant, close enough to exchange signals by flags, or what they called traveling in company, when a vessel or two would travel alongside each other. Seeing other ships was important as well, for they could check positions with each ship and verify their plottings. The vessel traveling west would be able to relay once home when they had last seen another ship and its location, much to the joy of families back home who may not have seen or heard from their families, sea captains, in months. No ship-to-shore radios or cell phones. Notice a good picture of the rat lines here. You can see the sort of ladder going up on the side. Noted especially were the roundings of Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope, as well as crossing the equator. The new crew were treated with a sort of hazing ceremony when crossing the equator. It might be anything from hair cutting to being tarred. My brother was in the Navy, and he talks about this, and he said, yes, he can tell from that guy is getting a haircut first, and who knows what happens later. This is a picture of the detail of the overhang of the cabin on the ship Benjamin F. Packard. In naval architecture, a poop deck is a deck that forms the roof of a cabin built in the rear or aft part of the superstructure of the ship. The name originates from the French word for stern, la poupe, from Latin pupus. These you can't tell very well, but they're hand drawings of the interior of various captains' ships. The bark Charlotte Littlefield was built in Bangor, Maine in 1891. She was commanded at one time by Lincoln A. Colcord of Searsport, Maine. This drawing was sent home by Mrs. Lincoln Colcord when she went to sea as a bride in the vessel. She wrote, "With the exception of a few additions put in by my husband, the plan is entirely accurate and meets with my approval. But you all know that orderliness is one of my virtues, and so will disregard what he insinuates. The cabin is as cozy as can be." Several unusual features appear in the plan: the substitution of a small clothes press for the starboard stateroom and entrance to the bathroom directly from the after cabin. So as you can see, these cabins were not big, not a lot in them. Since so much time was spent in the cabin, let's learn what the cabin was actually like. At sea, the captain's family lived in what was known as the after cabin and took its meals in the forward cabin. Although there were differences between ships and a few changes in design as the 19th century wore on, the accommodations were much the same in their essential features. The after cabin was entered by a companionway, a short flight of stairs. You can see them there. There were small square windows all around, which were protected by heavy shutters that could be closed in bad weather, and a large raised skylight in the center. At night, light was provided by swinging whale oil or kerosene lanterns. The captain's stateroom was in one corner. Another corner held the bathroom and toilet, which drew water from two tanks, which offered a choice of salt or fresh. Remember, fresh water was a premium only to be resupplied when you were in port. The bathroom contained the ship's medicine chest, which was stocked with everything from castor oil to morphine. The remaining two corners held two more staterooms, leaving a cross-shaped area in the center of the cabin known as the main salon. The alcoves at the sides were fitted with built-in sofas, ornately carved and richly upholstered, and a sideboard was built between the two doors that led to the forward cabin. A few easy chairs and a table completed the furnishings of the after cabin. When the ship was underway, the saloon or parlor had the clean, stripped-down appearance implied by the term shipshape. All the furniture was bolted down. Expensive carpets that could not withstand the accidental wetting with seawater were stowed away, and the great clutter of knickknacks and pictures was packed up. But whenever the ship dropped anchor, the captain's wife put things to rights again according to her own standards. Out came tablecloths and doilies, music boxes and china tea sets, quantities of photographs in fancy frames, until the main saloon was transformed into the typical Victorian parlor, where the captain's wife would entertain other captains and wives in port at dinner and elegant tea parties. Frances sewed using various fabrics given to her or purchases that she made when in port. She used a lot of Chinese silk. She speaks of mending her husband's clothing as well. She wrote of eventually acquiring a sewing machine and how much she enjoyed having it. However, she also tells of the difficulty of using the treadle mechanism on a rolling sea. Can you imagine? She writes of reading daily, both silently to herself and aloud in the evenings to her husband Stanley. She read any and everything from the Fairy Queen to psychic phenomena. It was fun to read that while she read to Stanley one evening, he was knitting mufflers for his crew. She relates of bathing and washing her hair, certainly not a daily luxury. She speaks of making almond creams and other sweets on occasions. On December 24th, 1885, she made candy and cornballs for the officers and molasses for the men. This was clearly a Christmas celebration, but little was recorded as too much more of a celebration of any holiday. She would note only that she might have received a gold sovereign from Stanley. Dogs were companions on board as well, and Frances and Stanley had 3 at various times. Here is Stanley with his dog, Topsy. Some of the other journals I've read about talk about children tending chickens and other small animals while on board. The loss of these animals, or learning of a man overboard, seemed to ride heavily on the women who were more emotional than men. Men of the sea had long since learned to steel themselves from such eventualities. From the book Hen Frigates, Wives of Merchant Captains Under Sail by Joan Druitt, we hear from Mary Radell, who sailed on the bark Henry Warren out of Bath, Maine in 1906. She relates that less than 3 weeks after they departed, they had run out of chickens. So it became bread and beef one day and beef and bread the next. She added, "Suppose, as I am to be a sailor, 'tis proper that I should begin betimes to grow fat on salt beef." Marion Murphy, in a letter to home, talked of her chickens on board. She had a good layer, but the ship's cat frightened it overboard. Other wives complained that hens did not lay well at sea. It was very evident that the fowl, pigs, and sheep aboard were not there as pets, although children enjoyed them that way. For 1 week, there may have been several meals of poultry, and later on, several meals of nothing but mutton. When a pig failed to appear on board, one knew what was for dinner for the several nights coming. Meals aboard ship were served by a steward and were better fare most of the time than the crew received. Frances writes on November 24, 1892, of a flooded galley, lost a large quantity of lime juice. Remember, in those days, scurvy was a real concern, and lime juice was its remedy. Biscuits, flour, salted pork, peas, cheese, butter, and salted fish were staples, things that remained edible for a long period of time. They carried live chickens, turkeys, geese, pigs, even cows and sheep and goats on board some ships. Those heading out from New England drank cider, beer, Madeira wine, and rum. Food was dried, salted, smoked, or pickled. The age of the provisions, the damp of environment, damage from an accident, improper cooperage or packaging, and infestations all contributed to food and drink becoming inedible. Biscuits were not sweet as they are regarded today, but instead consisted mostly of wholemeal flour, salt, and water. A suet pudding was steamed or boiled with raisins, currants, and spices. Whortleberry pie was a treat when they were in the Far East. Whortleberries are basically an Asian blueberry. Fresh food was stored anywhere on ship where there was room. Often bananas or plantains and other fruit were suspended upon the deck from aloft, and the ship looked very festive. Cabins were full of the finest oranges, limes, pineapples, coconuts, guavas, tamarinds, and mangoes. Angie Chapman, in her journal, mentioned in the book Windjammer Bride, tells of what was found in Singapore. A variety of fruits found here is great, and the names hard to ascertain. The green orange is sweet and very juicy, the pineapple delicious, though many people decline it. It has never made me ill, whatever time of day I take it. It always seems that I crave it. The other fruits I do not eat after 1 o'clock. The mangosteen is a most tempting fruit, smaller than an orange and in similar sections, with a hard seed in the center of each. The durian is called the fruit of the East, but I have not yet learned to like it. It has a most disagreeable oniony odor. Fresh water was longed for when out at sea for long periods of time. Water brought on board in casks often grew organisms over time. Women spoke of having to hold their noses while drinking it. Water gotten from the River Platte was very muddy, but if settling long enough, it became clear. Mary Stark wrote in 1855 of water in new casks tastes very strong of pitch pine or bilge water. And rainwater caught off the cabin roof is strong of tar or paint. Sometimes lemon juice was added to help the taste. From the book Sail Away Ladies come 2 accounts of food on board ships. Clara Cook, writer of Provincetown aboard the N.D. Chase, acted as hostess when Captain Cowans of the Scottish vessel bark Cherokee came aboard. He enjoyed his meal of stuffed turkey and mince pie. He reciprocated by inviting Clara on board his own vessel and presented her with a dozen bottles of claret wine and some books. He sent along a box of sweetmeats for the 2 boys. Clara reports of a terrible storm and that 4 days after the weather had turned calm, she had fried porpoise for breakfast, as was her routine, and her stomach returned to normal. Bethia Knowles May Sears of Brewster, 19-year-old wife of Captain Alicia Freeman Brewster, sailed from San Francisco to the Far East aboard the clipper Wild Ranger. She recorded eating pork and beans for dinner with gooseberry pie for dessert and washing the meals down with spruce beer. Frances mentions in April of 1895, while in the Java Sea, of a boat coming alongside to sell pumpkins and yams. In August of 1896, they landed in Niger, and they were able to get fresh meat and potatoes. In June of 1897, she recorded that while in Hongo, Vietnam, nothing can be had but chickens. They clearly needed to start out well provisioned and gather new foodstuffs whenever they were in port. It seemed logical that fish would be a staple part of the diet while at sea, and fresh as well. However, care was needed with what they caught, and some fish were poisonous. Dolphin, a popular catch, was cooked with a silver coin to check for poison. If the coin went black, the fish was thrown away. Emma Prey noted that fish caught in the Kobe waters of Japan Harbor were poisonous because of copper salts, which leached from coppered hulls of sailing ships in port. The Far East was most often the Adolph Obrig's destination, returning to Baltimore, New York, or San Francisco. Note that the pilot boats were under sail in that era. Think of tugboats coming and taking ships in and out of harbors now. They were under sail. Generally, their voyages lasted about 4 months. In 1895, they sailed from September of that year until May of 1896 between Saigon, Vietnam, Cochin, China, Singapore, and back to New York, a total of 9 months out. In March of 1903, the bark Adolph Obrig was chartered from Manila, Philippines. They crossed the equator on April 28th and rounded the Cape of Good Hope of Africa 2 months later. After a voyage of 136 days, they reached Manila. On November 5th, they headed out of Singapore, and on December 28th, left Singapore for New York, arriving in late April of 1904. It was not uncommon to have to stay in a port for a period of time, perhaps even months, awaiting the shipping company's word of a contract and then the loading of cargo itself. Frances kept track of their sailings on her own charts, and her chart is right here on the table as well. These are not actual ship's logging charts, but maps of the world on which she recorded day by day their travels. You can see the markings of each day during a year, and note that some days they didn't go very far at all, and other days they had good winds with them. See that there are notated 5 journeys on this chart. You can see the chartings as they left New York, for instance, as well as when they rounded the Cape of Good Hope off of Africa. When ships arrived in Hong Kong or other ports, it gave women a chance to catch up on mail. Frances writes of being homesick periodically, and hearing from her friends and parents were her salvation. At one point, she had been home in Rockport, Maine, when her father was beset with dizzy spells and growing weaker by the day. She wrote of finding out rather suddenly that they were to sail by week's end, and she lamented that she might never see her father again. Think how long she might have had to go without knowing the status of life back at home. I should point out that the wives were to be available to sail whenever the captain said, "We sail." When a vessel was contracted and loaded with cargo, they left port, often with only a few days' notice. At least there was the lure of exotic ports to get them through the hard times at sea. These are some Malaysian children in one port. This is a Shanghai mother and her child appear happy to be photographed. People in Shanghai, so many different cultures were they able to see on their travels. They would also be wined and dined once in port by other captains and their wives. When in port, they became a community of their own, visiting each other aboard ships and having dinner and tiffin together in port. Tiffin is like a late lunch or tea. Jane Colcourt writes in a letter from Hong Kong dated October 22nd, 1899, Our going has already commenced. It seems as if I had hardly a moment to myself all this week. Tuesday, we had tiffin at Mrs. Reeves, staying till 4:30, when we came down to the waterfront to meet the men. And who should be with them but Stanley Amesbury, who has been disabled in a typhoon by loss of rudder and was put in here. Nothing would do, but we put right off on board to supper with him, which we did, not getting home till very late. He is anchored way up in Wan Chi. We are at the other end of the harbor. Sometimes they would stay a few days at a nice hotel, where they loved the luxury of hotel life, the company of friends, and the steadiness of land. Days were sometimes spent playing croquet, and whist was played after dinner. I think Frances is the one wearing the coolie hat and holding the tennis racket right in front, and the coolie hat is over there on the table. One of the most well-known families of sailing came from Searsport, Maine. Captain Lincoln Alden Colcord and his wife Jane and their children Joanna and Lincoln, both of whom were born at sea. They crossed paths with the Amesburys both at home and in China and Singapore. In the book A Day's Work, a sampler of historic Maine photographs 1860 to 1920, author W.H. Bunting tells of the story of young Joanna Colcord recalling from her first memory of the wind-driven sea. When I was 8, I took my turn at seafaring, and Link, her brother, got his introduction to the halls of learning, which meant he was left back at home because he was a boy and he had to go to school. We put out from Portland, lumber-laden, into a full gale of wind, and I was seasick for the first and last time. On the 4th day out, it fared away, and my father took me, convalescent now, on deck and set me inside a life ring that was lashed to the top of the afterhouse. I remember nothing of my birth voyage, of course, but I was not afraid, and I remember to this day the awe and enchantment of that scene. I thought I had never seen anything so beautiful, and I think so still. The little barkentine was running bravely among the great seas, which heaved up all around in the sunlit walls of liquid sapphire. When she rose on one of the huge swells, the sea stretched to the horizon, a living blue, barred with a mile-long white-topped combers. The sun warmed me, and its play on the snowy white sails fascinated me. She also talked about how she felt being a girl on board a ship. My brother was early allowed to climb aloft, but this joy was always declined me. And as I got older, my range on deck was restricted more than his. I might not go forward of the main mast, and I must always behave quietly, like a lady. Also, I had to learn to sew, and he did not. Tomboy that I was, all this irked me deeply, but I toed the mark. In the book Letters from Sea, 1882 to 1901, written by Joanna Colcord, she writes about a letter to her father, of her father's to her brother. The letter is from Bayonne, New Jersey, and it says, Stanley Amesbury in the Adolph Obrig finished loading at the pier next and will stay in Amoy, China soon. A journal entry from December 1900 in Hong Kong relates, we have been hoping that the Amesburys would arrive before we left, but I'm afraid we are not to see them. They were bound for Chifu, but the charter has been changed, and they are to come here instead. They are making a very long passage, 182 days already. I hope nothing's happened to them, but I can't help but feeling a little uneasy. You may sense how they all watched out for each other and kept track as best they could of where their fellow China traders were on the briny seas. Another story from the same book comes from the Tapley family. Unlike many shipborne children who were named for the foreign location of their birth, Adelaide was born in Maine. She was named for the port that her father's ship, the St. James, entered the day of her birth. Captain Tapley's one-word cable, Adelaide, conveyed his wishes. Tapley's wife, Agnes, was the daughter of a sea captain as well, and whatever she thought of being named Agnes, she was likely thankful that she had not been named for the Chilean port of Iquique, where she was born in the cabin of the bark Eva Fisk. Frances, in turn, refers to her journals to meeting the Colcords and Tapleys in Manila, as well as China, Singapore, and at home in Maine. In Manila, Frances refers to meeting the Colcords. They went ashore, and Captains Curtis, Colcord, and Amesbury, let me go back to that, hired a carriage, but the ladies used it mostly. In August of 1897, she writes from Hong Kong that they had seen Captain Colcord, whom they saw in Singapore. The wives loved female company and spent their days in port shopping a great deal. They often purchased fabric for their sewing. They also had dresses made of Chinese silk. They also bought jewelry, cloisonne, jade, rosewood boxes, satsuma vases and porcelains, tapestries and lacquerware. Inlaid sewing boxes, paintings, and furniture were sought-after items. The following several pictures show some of the items that she purchased and that I now own. The largest item in the picture is what's called a monkey ball. It's carved ivory. To create the work, carvers would first have started with a solid piece of ivory that would be turned on a lathe to form a sphere-like structure. The carver would then make the specific layers of the piece before carving the delicate details. Most puzzle or monkey balls have approximately 20 layers or balls and intricate dragons on the outside. Ours is not so intricate anymore because my brother had a friend visiting one night when we weren't finished dinner, and Andy was sent into the living room and tossed a basketball around and hit the monkey ball. And so the pieces inside are in many pieces now. These are cinnabar boxes in a vase. Sword from the case from the Philippines, and a Chinese mahjong set. And a friend here and I are in the midst of taking mahjong lessons, and so I've pulled this out, and this is a very interesting set because it's all made of bamboo. This is a satsuma bowl and urn, and if you look at the little urn, you can see a little man climbing up over the side of it, and that is there, we believe, to show the perspective of the size of the bowl. This is a cloisonne vase, a rose medallion bowl. In 1898, she records purchasing a tea set and ordering a tea basket. In 1901, Frances writes in her journal that she had gotten a rattan bracelet with gold mounting. She writes in 1903 from Hong Kong as well that, quote, her eagle pin came in a registered package. I am wearing both of these treasured pieces. I'm also wearing a necklace made of the various Chinese pieces of money. You can look at these closer. She wrote another entry of loving a cabinet with ivory handles that had been purchased. My brother now owns this cabinet as well as the following pieces. We don't know why Jojo was named Jojo or really quite where he came from, but that's what his name has always been. In their journeys, they saw Krakatoa, the famous volcano of Indonesia, which blackened skies all over the world for 3 days and killed 36,000 people in 1883. They visited Napoleon's home in exile, Longwood, on the island of Elbe. They visited the lush country of Vietnam. Frances writes of seeing water spouts in the China Sea. They look just like they do in Geographic. Incidentally, Geographic was first published in 1888. She writes as well from Hongo, Vietnam, of sometimes the men do not wear any clothing but a turban affair on their heads. What a world this woman saw who was dressed in Victorian clothes. Frances made some interesting entries in her journal about life in the world. On March 4th, 1893, while off the coast of California, she had just found out that Grover Cleveland is president. On January 22nd, 1901, she has found out that Queen Victoria has died at age 82, having reigned for 62 years. Always she journaled about the weather. In July of 1894, she records strong gale, heavy sea, tore the spire top mast from lashings. In August, no steerage for 10 hours. And also in August, a very bad sea in the Indian Ocean. Stove port corner of wheelhouse in and filled cabin with water. Nasty. In November of the same year, near the Santa Ana Islands of Indonesia, she spoke of the cabin being leaky, especially over my bed, hot and sticky. In November, the bark split 2 upper topsails. They caught 4 sharks. In December, they made Capon Light Island in the Philippines, and in January saw quite impressive fireworks in celebration of the Chinese New Year. In 1896, during a December storm, a small whirlwind went across the stern, jibed the spinnaker, and broke the boom. Sails blowing galore. Awful weather. Decks are full of water. Horrid. Cargo shifts one way and then the other. Shifting cargo was very worrisome, for the equilibrium of the ship could be in jeopardy. February of 1897 saw icebergs in the Indian Ocean. December 1898 just managed to squeeze by the Cape of Good Hope tonight with heavy seas and light wind. The corners of the hand-stitched sail made in the 1800s. Canvas sails were made of hemp. Hemp is 3 times stronger than jute and was preferred because it was unaffected by salt water, rather important when sailing the high seas. You'll see right here and over on the table, and feel free to touch that on the table, these are part of the Obrig sails. And you can experience how heavy this canvas is. Think of them when you're touching one of them, how heavy they would be. Think of the size of them on the ship and how heavy they would be when wet. You can see in this picture the crew reefing the mainsail for heavy weather. You can barely see them climbing up. Think how heavy the canvas sail would be when wet. Another entry comes from Windjammer Bride by Angie Chapman, written in her journal. No tongue can describe, no written words depict a ship in a hurricane. Fancy yourself suddenly removed from the quiet of a calm, sunny day to the back of a trough of a roaring, boiling sea during the darkest of the black night. They could not be found in illustration, a parallel scene, for none exists, to be compared with the uproar, the terrible confusion of a tempest striking a ship. The furious wind is no single voice, but a pealing orchestra that runs the whole gamut from hollow, thunderous, deep-toned echoes to screams as shrill as those of the mad, while the black, lowering sky frowns down upon it from the great clouds that go furiously sweeping across her surface. The combination of noises upon deck defied description. Every timber straining and creaking, sails slatting, sheets flying about and lashing the deck when loosened by the wind, and the thud of the tremendous seas, which every now and then break against her bulwarks, with the roar of the tempest drowning the voices of captain and officers as they shriek out in deafening tones their constant orders, while every few moments a great volume of water strikes the ship like a thunderbolt, as if it were some unheard-of monster that had leaped upon her out of the darkness, bent upon devouring her in its wrath. The journal notes are from Captain Amesbury, where he remarks that he was, quote, had never seen a bigger sea off of Cape Horn. The following note comes from a newspaper clipping. For hours on end, Captain Stanley Amesbury himself hung over the stern of the ship, struggling to fasten a main-shift rudder. The heavy seas constantly buffeted him, battered his tense body, and swelled his taut nerves with untold pressure. Pushed beyond his limits, Captain Amesbury nonetheless succeeded. His jury-rigged rudder put them safely into port. Newspapers all over the world hailed his feat as, quote, one of the most heroic and masterful pieces of seamanship ever known. Reports later were that he had been hit on the head while rigging the rudder, and those that encountered him reported that he was never quite the same after that. In March of 1898, Frances writes, "It is awfully hard to leave after being home." Frances Brastow Amesbury's last voyage with her husband Stanley was in 1903. Stanley had had a couple of trips without her, one in 1899, which he wrote about in his journal. The Adolf Obrig was trapped in the midst of a terrible typhoon in the China Sea. A great deal of rigging was ripped and torn away. Worst of all was the rudder and tiller, which were smashed and left them without steerage. Stanley was able to jury-rig some semblance of a rudder once the storm was abated. His last voyage was in 1905 without Frances, and she says in her journal of January 23rd, 1905, "Oh, the horror of it. Stanley is gone forever, and by his own hand." Despondency had overtaken him, and Frances was not to learn of his fate for months until a ship came into Rockport with the news that he had shot himself. It was not until May of 1905 that she finally received his belongings and found it awful to look them over. A memorial service for Stanley Amesbury was held 2 months later, in July of 1905, when his ashes were finally received. She continued to receive letters from him for many months as other ships came into Rockport that he had encountered in his travels. Frances continued with her life in Rockport, Maine, spending some time teaching school, not all that happily. In January of 1910, she married Ralph W. Carleton, one of the owners of the Carleton Norwood Shipbuilding Company, and also her cousin. That was not so unusual in the era, I've learned. Even though she never went out to sea again, she certainly lived within the heritage of the great sailing ships and their men. The following pictures are of her home with Ralph Carleton in Rockport, Maine. This picture is as it looked in the late 1800s, and it's the most towering building you see. The following pictures are of her home as it looks now. My family had the good fortune to visit and see what the present owners had done to preserve this wonderful history of the home. And you can see their view of Rockport Harbor is right there. Note the wonderful figurehead in the front hall. The house was originally built by Ralph Carleton's father, also a sea captain. When he was in China, he was having the house built and knew the proper dimensions of the staircase, and so had it built in China and brought back to Rockport. We were always told as children about the Chinese staircase in this house, and we never quite understood what it was all about, and then there it is. Incredibly elaborate. It's just amazing to see. Dining room cabinet is full of beautiful blue Canton china. Frances and Stanley together on the bark Adolph Obrig. This weather vane of the bark Adolph Obrig sat upon the roof of my home in Connecticut when we were children. It now sits atop my brother's home in California. It will always serve as a memory of an adventuresome ancestor and a reminder of living life to its fullest. Frances Amesbury Carleton's life was exemplified in a wonderful poem written by Jim Coogan in his book, Sail Away, Ladies. Sail away, ladies, sail far away. Chart your course across the waves and mark your passage by a star. Sail away, ladies, sail on free. Daughters of the rolling sea, your bridal bed is at sea. Sail away, ladies, navigate the foam. Whales and tails and howling gales now find you far from home. Sail away, ladies, knock on Neptune's door. With your captain close beside, stand against the ocean's roar. This is a final picture of Frances, Woman of the Sea. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
How young were you, and in what way did you learn all of this history? Was it from a parent, or?
That's a good question, because I actually never knew my Aunt Frances. My father and my brother, and his brother lived in inland Pennsylvania, and interesting enough, went to Maine several summers to be with their Aunt Frances and spend the summer and learn about the family heritage up there. And my dad then sailed boats and ran motorboats in Connecticut. And it wasn't until we learned to sail that we learned that he had never learned to swim. So my dad was the one that told us about this. We were semi-interested because our house was loaded with all these Chinese antiques always. But in terms of reading the journals, we were not so interested. You can see they're difficult to read and whatnot. My dad died of a heart attack at age 54, and I was in college at that point, and after college was home with my mom, and we got reading these journals. And she would be in her bedroom, and I would be in mine, and we would call out to each other, "Listen to this!" And we got absolutely wrapped up and fascinated in them. And so I've always sort of had that bee in the back of my bonnet. And my brother's always been very interested as well. So that's how we learned about it. Well, there are lots of things you can look at up here if you want to. So on the table, there's an ivory painting of her and the coolie hat and a copy of her diary. There's a Bible that was given to the crew of the Adolf brig and a Bible that it was hers. And obviously the Chinese kimono outfit here is actually a man's outfit. It's not for women, it's for men. And some painting on silk. And this painting on the front of us, on the front of the podium, is a cut velvet painting. So it's actually cut into the velvet. If you touch it in places, you can feel the velvet. Of Mount Fuji in Japan. We always thought it was a wonderful thing, and my husband was quite convinced that it was an original Hokusai painting. It was in a beautiful carved wood frame that eventually fell apart. We lived in Washington, D.C., and the Freer Gallery had an appraisal day, and he asked if I would take this in because he was sure it was worth a fortune. So I trundled it across the mall in Washington and into this fellow, and he basically looked at it and he said, "Did you ever go to Europe?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Did you ever buy postcards in France?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Postcard in China, in Japan in those days, not worth anything." Done.
Did Frances ever comment about the food or the preparation or assist in that way of life?
Not somewhat she did, but not a whole lot. A lot of that I've gleaned from other journals and other books that I've read. The captain's wives did very little on that score. I did talk about her making things at Christmas time for the crew. And that was about all the cooking they did because they had a steward on board who did all the cooking. So you basically weren't allowed in the galley. Yeah.
I saw San Francisco in one of the pictures. Was there many journeys that found their way
Yes.
to the West Coast?
Yes. And the beautiful Chinese cabinet that my great aunt liked so much is now in my brother's possession. And that was one of the things that a cousin of my brother and I always said, we're going to fight over that piece. We didn't. It became very clear that there are lots of New England antiques we have as well, so the New England thing stayed with me, and I was able to swallow hard and relinquish the Chinese cabinet because we knew it had come in through San Francisco, and so it was kind of going home again too. Yeah.
Did she ever talk about her fear of drowning in her journals?
No, not at all. Not at all. No. I'm astounded at what brave women these were. Just really brave. I mean, I love the sea, but if somebody told me that, you've just been married and you're headed out to sea for who knows how long, you're not sure whether you're going to make it to where you're going, and you sure don't know what the weather's going to be or what you're going to eat, I would have said, I think I'll stay home. Pat?
Ever mention anything about the joy of giving birth on the ship?
She had no children.
Oh, she had.
No, she had no children, which is why she liked my brother and my uncle so much. They were very special to her. But the Colcord family their children were born on board ship. Stanley Amesbury, her husband, was born on board ship. There are many, many books and journals that talk about families of generations being born on ships. Yeah, it's really fascinating. It really is. But just a sidelight, interesting little tale. I have a friend that has a house near ours down here that lives in Maine. She has another friend named Betty. It makes it easier to tell the story. And she had Betty come down here one time and had us come over, and she said, you have a story you need to tell your friend Betty, my friend Betty. And it was about this sailing wife. And I thought, oh, I don't know, they lived in Rockport, Maine, so it was of interest to her for that. But I thought, I don't know. And she said, no, you really do need to tell this story. So I told her about my great aunt and the Carlton Norwood Shipbuilding Company. Her eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger, and my friend knew what was going on. And it turns out her great-grandfather sailed one of the Carlton Norwood ships, of which the Billings, you saw a picture, which the Billings was the greatest four-masted ship built at the time. And he captained that ship at about the same time that Captain Stanley Amesbury was sailing. So we've conjectured that they knew each other well in this little town of Rockport, Maine, working for the same sailing company. And here, 2 generations later, through a mutual friend who didn't know any of them, we meet. So it's kind of fun. Kind of fun. Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.